She barely touched the stem of the glass. A second later, the flight attendant's hand came down fast, hard, and unapologetic. "That's not for economy." The words landed louder than the slap. Clear, condescending, inescapable, heads turned, eyes narrowed. Someone coughed, unsure whether to step in or stay seated. But the woman who had just been humiliated didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She simply stared, calm, collected, silent, as if she knew something no one else in that cabin did. And she did. Because the person she had just been slapped by worked for her. She wasn't some misplaced coach passenger. She wasn't a guest. She owned the plane. She owned the company that owned the plane. And yet, she had just been treated like an intruder on her own aircraft. But this story isn't about revenge. It's not about wealth flexed to punish a mistake. This moment, this single act of humiliation, sits on the tip of something much bigger. Something older. Something personal. Something that's happened 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, just not always on a jet flying at 35,000 feet. This story doesn't start in that cabin. It starts long before. In boardrooms where she wasn't taken seriously, at airports where she was asked if she was in the right line, in elevators where people clutched their bags just a little tighter. And one cold Tuesday morning, it finally reached the surface. Not with shouting. Not with anger. Just one moment of misjudgment that would cost someone everything and reveal who really had the power all along. But the part no one on that jet knew, this wasn't the first time she'd been slapped. Not physically, but in other ways. Quieter ones, dismissive glances, patronizing tones, the assumption that she didn't belong. This time, though, someone made a very expensive mistake, and she would handle it, not with fire, but with silence so sharp it could cut glass. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world. When she reached for that champagne, she wasn't thirsty. She was tired. Tired of pretending not to notice. Tired of being polite while people like Melissa, people who'd never built a thing, questioned if she belonged in spaces she owned. And as that flight took off, something else rose too. Not anger, not ego, but a quiet decision that would change everything. For the flight attendant, for the company, and for every passenger who thought they understood who had the real authority in that cabin. Because in a matter of minutes, this jet would become more than a mode of transportation. It would become a stage, and the entire crew was about to learn who they were really working for. Avery Monroe never looked like what most people imagined when they heard the word billionaire. No red carpet entrances, no diamond-drenched selfies. If you passed her at an airport, you might have thought she was an analyst, a lawyer on her way to a modest meeting. She preferred it that way. Her skin glowed from cocoa butter and discipline, not surgery. Her nails were clean, short, polished with clear gloss. Hair in a sleek twist that was part style, part function. Her entire wardrobe could have fit into a single carry-on, and often did. The bag she carried onto that jet? A brown leather satchel with one frayed strap. She'd had it since sophomore year of college. She refused to replace it. It reminded her of a time when the only thing inside it was a half-dead phone, a cracked calculator, and the weight of wanting more. But people saw what they wanted to see, and they rarely saw her for what she was. Behind the quiet expression and polite nods was a mind that never rested. Numbers, patterns, opportunities, they came naturally to her. But what didn't come naturally was being seen. Not in the tech world, not in investor meetings, and definitely not in first class. She was used to being invisible in places she paid to enter. It started early, south side of Chicago, 2-bedroom walk-up that often felt like one. Her mom, Gloria, worked in the basement kitchen of a downtown hospital, prepping salads and wiping down counters. She worked 3 shifts a week in compression socks with holes in them. Not because she didn't want new ones, but because her daughter's laptop needed an upgrade more than her feet needed comfort. Her dad vanished before she turned 3. No child support, no birthday calls, not even a shadow of a memory. But Avery didn't carry that like a wound. She carried it like a fact. Her mother had a way of saying things once and making them permanent. If they can't see your worth, baby, that's their blindness, not your burden. Keep your head up, your voice firm, and your work louder than your feelings." Avery listened, not just to her mom's advice, but to the way the world worked. She watched how boys who failed upwards still got second chances, while girls like her had to fight for half a seat at the table. She noticed how the teachers smiled wider at students with certain last names, how the counselors steered her toward safe schools, even when her scores were Ivy League strong. She stopped expecting fairness early, but she never stopped expecting more from herself. By 15, while most kids were sneaking into house parties or burning hours on Tumblr, Avery was building websites for local barbershops and family-run bakeries. She used outdated code on an ancient desktop computer that shut down every time it overheated. Still, she made it work. One site at a time, she saved enough to buy her own laptop. And then, it was over. She was off. By 17, she launched an app that helped small businesses track orders and customer feedback. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. She made a couple thousand, reinvested every cent. By 21, she'd sold her second app, this one much sharper, to a Fortune 500 tech company. They offered her a junior role on their product team. She turned it down, started her own. 3 years later, her AI firm wasn't just profitable, it was dominant. She signed deals in 5 languages, raised capital without giving up her name, launched partnerships with 3 global universities, and she kept receipts. Not just of transactions, but of people. The ones who doubted, who talked over her in meetings, who asked if she was there to take notes, who smiled too wide when she entered a room, then quietly questioned her expertise after she left. One investor once asked if her dad had built the company and she inherited it. She just smiled. "No," she said, "he built nothing. But thank you for showing me how much you assume before I even open my mouth." "They don't see you yet," her mentor had said, pouring tea from an old kettle. "They don't want to." "One day," Avery replied, her voice steady, "they won't be able to ignore me." She was right. By 32, she owned a fleet of private aircraft, not for luxury, but for efficiency. One jet saved her 2 days a week in travel. 2 jets expanded her reach. The third, that was a gift to herself. A symbol, not to flaunt, but to remember. That third jet was the one she was on that day. The one where she was slapped like a stranger. The irony didn't miss her. The billions didn't buy her respect, not until they Googled her name. The jet didn't shield her from the sting of racism, it just made the moment echo louder. Because in that cabin, surrounded by polished leather and polished lies, a flight attendant saw a black woman in a casual sweater, an assumed employee or mistake. She saw skin, not ownership. She saw presence, not power. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Just another chartered jet, another meeting in a foreign city where old money tried to size her up before realizing they were already 2 steps behind. Her company had secured the aircraft through one of the most reputable private jet firms in the world. Top-tier service, strict confidentiality, a vetted crew. Zurich wasn't new territory for her, and neither was the quiet act of traveling alone, under the radar. She preferred it that way. Avery arrived early. No assistant, just her and that weathered satchel with a cracked zipper. Her outfit didn't say billionaire. It didn't even whisper it. Neutral hoodie, clean jeans, black boots. Her afro tucked beneath a gray knit beanie her mother had mailed her last winter. It still smelled faintly of lavender. There was no announcement of who she was. No one prepped the runway. No tinted convoy. She walked up the tarmac like she had a job to do. Because she did. That's when it began. From the moment she stepped onto the plane, something shifted in the air. Not loud, not immediate, but noticeable. The flight attendant stood near the galley. Buttoned up, blonde, early 40s. Melissa's expression didn't change much, but her eyes, they did the scan. Avery had seen it before. A glance too long at her clothes, a flick of the eyes to the manifest clipboard, a shallow smile that didn't reach the eyes. It wasn't overt. Not yet, but it was that small flicker of disbelief. Like Melissa was trying to figure out how this particular woman ended up in this particular place. Avery nodded in greeting. Melissa offered a polite, "Hello?" But it landed flat. Not rude, not warm, just measured. Avery made her way to the first row, seat 1A. Standard protocol, high-level execs sit up front on chartered flights, Faster exit, tighter security. Her name had been on that manifest for over a week. There was no error, no confusion. Still, Melissa's eyes followed her, tracked her movement like luggage that might have been misrouted. Avery sat down without comment. She didn't expect fanfare. But what followed? That wasn't oversight. That was a series of decisions. Small, sharp ones. The kind meant to feel subtle. The kind designed to slip past confrontation but still leave a mark. About 10 minutes into boarding, Avery politely asked Melissa if they had sparkling water. Melissa blinked. "We have water," she said, flat. Avery smiled. "Still or sparkling?" Melissa hesitated. "Just water," she replied, and disappeared down the aisle. She returned with a plastic cup of lukewarm tap water. No lemon, no ice. Avery thanked her, took the cup, and said nothing. She didn't need to. This wasn't about water. This was a tone being set. Next came the blanket. Cabin was cool. Not cold, but cooler than comfortable. Avery pressed the call button. Melissa arrived after a long pause. "Do you have any blankets?" Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Those are for the premium passengers." There it was. Not even subtle anymore. Avery didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at her seat again. Row 1. Premium cabin. The leather tag above her read A. Monroe. But she didn't argue. She sat still, let the silence stretch. Melissa blinked and stepped away, brisk and deliberate. It didn't matter that Avery was on the manifest. It didn't matter that the jet, the very reason for this journey, existed because of her company, her vision, her choices. In Melissa's eyes, she wasn't supposed to be there. She was out of place, wrong texture, wrong tone, wrong story. And people like Melissa had a way of making sure you felt that. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most passengers wouldn't have questioned it. But to Avery, it was familiar. This wasn't about one flight. This was about every room she'd walked into where her competence was questioned before she spoke. Every meeting where they assumed she was the assistant, not the CEO. Every handshake that had to be earned twice. She sat quietly for the next 20 minutes, pulled out her tablet, reviewed her Zurich notes, ignored the way Melissa skipped her row during the offer of pre-flight drinks. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't even disappointed. She was patient. That was the thing about Avery Monroe. She knew how to wait, because eventually, the people who underestimated her always gave themselves away. And then came the moment, the one that no one on that flight would forget. They were already cruising. Seatbelt signs off, cabin lights dimmed, the sound of the engines humming steady through the walls. Melissa came down the aisle with a silver tray, 2 flutes of champagne, the kind reserved for clients and C-level executives. Avery reached out calmly, more out of reflex than desire. And then, smack, a sharp sound. Melissa slapped Avery's hand away. Not hard, not violent, but fast, firm, audible, like she was swatting a toddler. Gasps from the back of the cabin. Eyes turned. Even the co-pilot, stepping out from the cockpit, froze mid-step. "That's not for economy," Melissa said, voice louder now, clipped, as if Avery were the one out of line. Avery stared at her. Blank. Not angry, not humiliated, just still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something shifts. What Melissa didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman she just humiliated wasn't some mistaken passenger. She owned the company, owned the jet, owned the software that processed the payment for the very tray she was holding. And everything she'd just done was recorded, not just by shocked passengers, but by the aircraft's internal surveillance system. A feature installed 6 months prior, after a separate liability incident. Melissa had no idea. She thought she was maintaining order, gatekeeping comfort. She had no idea she was walking herself straight into history. Avery didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain herself. Then around the cabin, measuring the moment. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional. Melissa wasn't just implying Avery didn't belong. She was making sure everyone else saw it too. She didn't care about the manifest, didn't care about the truth. She cared about reinforcing a boundary she thought she had the right to enforce. Avery inhaled once, deep, steady, and then she stood, slowly, gracefully, not an inch of apology in her posture. She looked Melissa directly in the eyes. "I'd like to speak to the pilot." Her voice was calm, dead calm, the kind that made people listen without knowing why. Melissa laughed, a sharp, dismissive noise. "Sweetie, if you don't sit down, you'll be removed." There it was, the threat. The quiet, nuclear option for women like Avery. Sit down, be silent, or be made to disappear. She'd seen that playbook before, but Melissa didn't understand who she was talking to, because at that moment, Avery smiled. It wasn't forced, it wasn't warm, it was the kind of smile you give when a checkmate is only 2 moves away. Good, Avery said. Then I suggest you call him. Melissa blinked. Something shifted behind her eyes. Uncertainty. Because there was something in Avery's tone that didn't match the narrative Melissa had built in her head. Something powerful, unbothered, unafraid. A ripple ran through the cabin. The women stopped whispering. Even the junior attendant near the galley froze, sensing the temperature change. Avery pulled out her phone. Not frantic, not performative. She opened an app, entered a passcode. A live security feed of the cabin appeared on her screen. Time-stamped. Archived. She tapped the screen once, sent the footage directly to her legal team with a swipe, then looked back at Melissa. I'm going to ask one more time, politely. I need to speak with the pilot, now. Melissa opened her mouth, then shut it. Because just then another voice entered the room. Is there a problem? The co-pilot, tall, salt and pepper hair, stepped forward from the cockpit. He glanced at Avery, then at Melissa. Ma'am? He asked Avery directly. Are you okay? She nodded once slowly, but her eyes didn't leave Melissa. I will be, after I speak to the captain. The co-pilot glanced at Melissa, confused. She's a manifest-listed executive, priority security clearance. Why wasn't I told there was an issue? Melissa's jaw clenched. Too late, the dam had broken. The pilot was alerted, the co-pilot already suspicious. The cabin in quiet chaos. Melissa's eyes flicked down to the manifest, for the first time, actually reading it. Her face strained. She stepped back instinctively, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Avery remained standing, poised, calm. She wasn't going to shout. She didn't have to, because in that silence, everyone heard her. Every damn word of it. She didn't storm. She didn't stomp. Avery Monroe walked down the narrow aisle with the same calm purpose that had carried her through boardrooms, government hearings, and investor battles. But make no mistake, every step she took down that aisle felt seismic. The co-pilot moved aside without a word as she approached the cockpit door. She tapped twice, gently, like she wasn't about to crack the cabin's illusion of hierarchy wide open. The door opened. The pilot turned from his seat, and for a second, he froze. He wasn't a stranger to high-net-worth clients. He'd flown diplomats, celebrities, and oil execs. But her? He knew her face instantly. Avery Monroe. He'd seen her in Forbes, Bloomberg, The Economist. Not just a CEO, the CEO of Cygnus Intelligence, the tech giant that had redefined AI infrastructure across 3 continents. The same company that had, 6 months ago, purchased the charter airline he now flew for. He blinked once, then straightened his spine like a soldier being called to attention. Miss Monroe? Her voice was low, but every syllable was sharpened steel. There's a staffing issue I need you to address, quietly, immediately. That was all she had to say. The pilot nodded. No hesitation, no questioning, no cover-up attempt. Because he knew this wasn't a PR storm in the making. This was a reckoning, and it was already too late to steer around it. He followed her back into the cabin. Every eye turned as he emerged. The women stiffened. Melissa's arms were crossed, lips tight, ready to hurl one last passive-aggressive retort, until the pilot spoke. Miss Monroe is the CEO of the firm that chartered this flight. She has every right to be here. She is, in fact, the reason any of us are here. He turned to Melissa. Please gather your things. Silence. It hit the cabin like a dropped piano. Even the engines seemed to hum quieter. Melissa didn't move. She blinked twice. Her mouth opened, searching for a lifeline in a sea that had just turned on her. Wait, what? She asked, her voice cracking like the first layer of ice on a spring lake. The pilot didn't waver. Melissa? Now. Still frozen, still calculating. Melissa looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would jump in. Defend her. Offer her the benefit of the doubt she'd never once extended to Avery, but all she saw were passengers shifting in their seats watching. No allies. Just witnesses. The junior attendant near the galley avoided her gaze entirely, and then? From the jet bridge, 2 uniformed security personnel stepped aboard. Not loud, not dramatic, just efficient, pre-cleared, stationed at the gate for this high-profile flight. A formality, until now. Melissa's eyes widened. Her voice got small. "You're kidding? You're actually kicking me off for her?" No one answered, because no one needed to. The guards approached, gentle but firm. They didn't cuff her, didn't drag her. They simply guided her toward the exit, her limbs stiff with disbelief, her lips pressed tight like she was holding back one final insult that wouldn't save her now. As she stepped off the jet, she turned her head, one last glance at Avery. But Avery didn't look back. Avery sat back down in her seat, same posture, same serenity. Nothing had changed about her, but everything around her had. The cabin's mood shifted, not out of fear, but respect. The co-pilot returned to the cockpit. The junior attendant, now pale and visibly nervous, approached cautiously, carrying a fresh flute of champagne. Not the old one from the tray, a new one, chilled, elegant, held with both hands like a peace offering. She didn't stammer, didn't over-apologize. She simply said, "Miss Monroe, we apologize, deeply. Champagne?" Avery accepted it with a small nod. No smirk, no condescension, no victory lap, just quiet grace. She raised the glass once, sipped, the bubbles rose, light and bright. The passengers didn't speak to her. Not yet. But some nodded. A few offered tight, shame-tinged smiles. The ones who had watched and said nothing. The ones who had let it happen until power reminded them who was really in the room. Avery leaned back. Let her head touch the leather headrest. She didn't need to gloat, because this wasn't about proving who she was. She knew that already. This was about never letting someone else define it for her. She pulled out her phone. No need to send the footage to legal again. They'd already responded. Her inbox showed 3 new messages. One from her general counsel, one from the head of HR at the charter company, and one from the press secretary, already drafting a proactive statement of values in case word leaked. She smiled faintly, but she wasn't interested in statements. Not yet. This wasn't about a press cycle. This was about drawing a line in the air mid-flight against centuries of subtle erasure. This was about showing every woman, every black executive, every doubted genius, that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand. Even when your hand is slapped, even when they try to reduce you to sweetie, even when they make you feel like you're trespassing in rooms you built from the ground up. The jet lifted into the sky minutes later, smooth and quiet. Altitude rose. Clouds passed. The champagne glass stayed steady in Avery's hand. Her reflection in the window showed the truth. Still her. Still here. Still rising. Word traveled, as it always does. The story filtered through corporate circles and private equity threads before it ever reached the blogs. It showed up in encrypted group chats among black executives, landed in Slack channels marked representation and hack accountability, then slowly found its way into the wider world. Whispers, rumors. A CEO had someone removed mid-flight. A billionaire black woman had someone fired in the sky. And like all stories in America, the facts bent depending on who told them. Some painted Avery as power-hungry, others called her graceful, but most people didn't know the details. They weren't there. And Avery? She said nothing. She didn't tweet, didn't issue a formal statement, didn't join the chorus of hashtags or retweet the few activists who picked it up as a viral moment, because it wasn't a moment for her. It was a lifetime, another entry in a long ledger of slights, humiliations, and near-invisible battles waged by people who look like her, sound like her, rise like her. She didn't have time for victory dances. She had a $140 million deal to close in Zurich. The boardroom in Zurich was all sharp lines and cold glass. The European investors had heard about the jet thing. One of them tried to bring it up. Subtly, of course. A question about travel disruptions. A sideways comment about American tension. Avery let him finish. Then she laid out her numbers, growth projections, AI patent licensing strategy, global rollout, regulatory compliance built into the architecture. By the end of the pitch, no one asked another personal question. She walked out with the deal signed. She returned to Chicago 4 days later. Still no statement, still no tweet, but she made one quiet decision. She summoned her head of operations and legal to a meeting, no assistants, no agenda, and gave a single directive. From this point forward, every staff member we work with, pilot, crew, contractor, partner, will go through mandatory racial bias and inclusion training. No exceptions. They nodded. And going forward, she added, We'll be partnering exclusively with Black-owned aviation firms for all private executive travel. Vet them. Bring me the best." No anger in her voice, just clarity. Because power in her world wasn't just about removing people who got it wrong. It was about building systems where getting it wrong was no longer an option. She didn't care if Melissa ever found another job. She cared where the next Avery, young, brilliant, underestimated, was ever made to feel like a trespasser on a plane her own mind had paid for. The press tried to drag her in. One outlet sent a request for comment, offering a platform to share your experience. Another framed the story as a new Rosa Parks moment in the skies. But Avery wasn't interested in being anyone's symbol. She was too busy being a strategist. She didn't need headlines. She needed infrastructure. Sometimes the deepest sting isn't being punished. It's realizing the person you tried to humiliate was the reason you were on the flight at all. And now she'd changed the trajectory, not just of her company, but of the system itself. Weeks passed. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, but the ripple effect didn't fade. An anonymous staff member from the charter company leaked an internal memo, Melissa's name redacted. The memo outlined new sensitivity protocols, a partnership with a civil rights nonprofit, a quiet settlement, no lawsuit needed. Avery had never filed one. She didn't have to, because that was the thing about power. Real power didn't beg for attention. Real power didn't shout. It recalibrated systems from the inside, silently, permanently. And that's exactly what she'd done. Avery returned to her Chicago office on a cloudy Wednesday. No press outside, no cameras. She rode the elevator alone, past the assistant who greeted her every day with a quiet "Morning, Miss Monroe." Her office was the same, minimalist, sleek, corner window facing the lake. She sat, breathed, and opened her laptop. There was a new hire request from the HR team. Young Black woman, product engineer, fresh out of MIT. Avery scanned the resume, approved it. No long interviews, no doubt, just trust. Because the real work, it wasn't about correcting Melissa. It was about creating a world where Melissa's power to humiliate was stripped away before it could ever reach its target. This wasn't just a story about a flight. It was a story about assumption, about what people think they know the moment you step into a room or onto a plane. About how centuries of bias don't disappear just because someone smiles at you or calls you ma'am. About how racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It hides behind policies, behind strained smiles and quiet denials, behind who's offered a towel and who isn't, behind who's asked to move and who never is. That's the irony, isn't it? Racism doesn't just insult, it underestimates. It refuses to believe you are who you say you are. It insists there must be a mistake. It tells you, no matter what you've built, no matter what you've earned, you don't belong here. But the truth? You've always belonged. You always will. Because the issue was never about whether you were enough. It was about whether they were ready to see you. Treat people with dignity because of who you should be. Because character is how you behave when no one's watching, especially when you think the person in front of you doesn't matter. Because grace isn't something you show to those who deserve it. It's something you extend because you've decided to live with integrity. Every day. To every person. Melissa isn't the villain of this story. She's a mirror. A reflection of a culture that still teaches us who deserves luxury, who looks like success, who belongs in first class. But Avery? She's the correction. The recalibration. The shift. The reminder that Black excellence doesn't always arrive in a three-piece suit. Sometimes it shows up in jeans and a beanie, quiet as a sunrise, and it changes everything without needing to shout. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world.